On September 1st, 1939, at 4:45 in the morning, the guns of the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein opened fire on the Polish garrison at Westerplatte. It was not history's first shot, but it was the one that opened 6 years of carnage in which between 70 and 85 million people would die. What followed was not inevitable. Every turn of that war depended on decisions that could have gone differently, on moments when the edge of history tilted just a few millimeters and the whole world turned with it. These are the 20 moments that changed the outcome of World War II. Before continuing, if you are a true World War II enthusiast, I want to show you something special. We have created a collection dedicated to the Battle of Berlin of 1945, with more than 200 historical photographs that are unpublished or very rarely seen. A collection that will let you visually travel through the last days of the Third Reich, soldiers, vehicles, destroyed streets, and surprising scenes from the battle. If you want to discover it in full, click the link in the description and get your collection now. 1. The Sichelschnitt Strike, the crossing of the Meuse and the Flanders Trap, May 10th to 15th, 1940. On the morning of May 9th, 1940, Belgian soldiers were planting pansies around their barracks. In Paris, the cafes were full, and the unofficial anthem of the moment was J'attendrai, I will wait. General Maurice Gamelin, the Allied commander-in-chief, had reinstated weekend leave. The next day, at 5:35 in the morning, the world those men knew began to crumble. The German offensive in the west was actually 2 simultaneous strikes designed so that the second would be invisible. The first, highly visible, pushed the German army into Holland and Belgium. Just as Gamelin had anticipated for months, the Allied forces, the British Expeditionary Force and France's best armies, rushed north to cover them. It was exactly what Berlin wanted. The second strike was Plan Sichelschnitt, the sickle cut, conceived by General Erich von Manstein and carried out by Army Group A under General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt. 44 divisions, including the largest concentration of armored forces ever assembled up to that point, advanced silently through the forests of the Ardennes, a region Gamelin had declared impenetrable to tanks. General Charles Hunziker, responsible for the Sedan sector, had only 3 reservist divisions. He had asked for 4 more. He was refused. His concrete positions did not even face the right direction. On the afternoon of May 13th, General Heinz Guderian launched his armored forces of the 19th Corps against the Meuse at Sedan. He set fire to houses on the riverbank to create smoke screens while his engineers crossed in rubber boats under heavy fire. That same afternoon, General Erwin Rommel, commander of the 7th Panzer Division, 36 years old, crossed the Meuse near Dinant after ordering his own tanks to fire on the French positions on the opposite bank. Rommel crossed the river with his men without armor, taking command of an infantry battalion when the French threatened to reverse the situation. French artillery in the Sedan sector had received orders to conserve ammunition. Its reservists, many of them veterans of the Great War who had no wish to die in another one, began to retreat. General Georges, commander of the Northeastern Front, received the news that night. Captain André Beaufray, who was with him, saw him collapse into a chair and burst into tears. "Our front has broken at Sedan," Georges told him. "There is a collapse." In 4 days, the panzers had opened a gap of almost 80 kilometers in the Allied front. The French armored divisions that tried to close it arrived late, out of fuel, blocked by columns of refugees. The RAF lost 40 of the 71 bombers sent against the bridges over the Meuse. The bridges remained standing. On May 20th, the columns of the Kleist Group reached the English Channel at Abbeville. The best Allied troops of France and Belgium were surrounded in the Flanders pocket. The Battle of France, in military terms, was already over. It had lasted barely 10 days from the first crossing of the Meuse. 2. The halt order at Dunkirk. 300,000 soldiers who were not supposed to escape, May 24th to 26th, 1940. On May 23rd, 1940, General Alan Brooke, commander of the British Second Corps, wrote in his diary, "Nothing but a miracle can save the BEF now." That miracle came in the form of a German mistake. On the night of May 23rd, General Oberst Günther von Kluge halted his 13 divisions along the canal line west of the Dunkirk pocket. The panzers of the Kleist group had lost more than 600 tanks in 3 weeks, more than half their armoured strength. The marshy terrain of northern Flanders was unsuited to armoured vehicles. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring claimed his Luftwaffe alone could destroy what remained of the British Expeditionary Force. Hitler, who had been nervous throughout the campaign, approved the pause the following day. This has often been described as a personal initiative by Hitler seeking to negotiate with Great Britain. Period documents, analysed by historian Anthony Beaver, show that it was Rundstedt who insisted on halting the armour, and Brauchitsch himself, commander of the German army, who initially gave the order. Hitler ratified it. The mistake lasted 48 critical hours. During that time, the Dunkirk perimeter was strengthened, and Operation Dynamo began to be organised. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, the Royal Navy and an improvised fleet of more than 800 vessels, warships, ferries, pleasure yachts, fishing barges, evacuated 338,226 soldiers from the beaches of Dunkirk. The North Sea in those days was strangely calm. It was, in the words of the naval historian, one of the calmest stretches of the season in decades. The French soldiers covering the rearguard, units of the Light Infantry Division and other corps that could not embark, were killed or taken prisoner. France lost its best troops in the pocket, but Britain recovered the core of its professional army. Without Dunkirk, Britain would have lost 300,000 combat-experienced soldiers along with their officers in a single blow. Churchill would have faced unbearable pressure to negotiate. The war, at best for the Allies, would have continued on different terms. At worst, it would have ended that summer. The miracle of Dunkirk did not save France, but it saved the war. 3. The Battle of Britain, Hitler's first defeat, August to October 1940. The summer of 1940 belonged to Germany. Hitler had conquered in 6 weeks what the Kaiser had failed to achieve in 4 years. The Reich's generals offered him the title of First Soldier of the Nation. At the Kroll Opera House in Berlin, before the full Reichstag, Hitler offered Britain an honourable peace. Churchill did not even respond officially. The Luftwaffe had 656 Messerschmitt 109 fighters, 168 twin-engine Me 110 fighters, 769 bombers, and 316 Stukas at airfields in northern France. RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had 504 Hurricanes and Spitfires to defend the British Isles. The numerical inferiority was real. On August 13, 1940, Adlertag, Eagle Day, the Luftwaffe launched its great offensive. That afternoon, 300 aircraft attacked southern England. Fighters of No. 609 Squadron shot down 6 Stukas in a single interception. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost 47 aircraft to 13 British, but there was something the Luftwaffe did not understand. Dowding was not just a commander, he was an architect. He had built an integrated system of coastal chain radar, observation posts, control centers, and telephone lines that let his squadrons take off almost exactly when needed, without wasting fuel or time on pointless patrols. The Germans attacked the radar masts, but even when they damaged them, the technicians repaired them within hours. They attacked the airfields and managed to seriously damage several. Fighter Command began to feel the strain. The turning point came on the night of August 24th, when a formation of more than 100 German bombers flew over their targets and, by mistake, bombed central London. Churchill immediately ordered retaliatory strikes on Berlin. Göring, furious and humiliated, made the decision that sealed the fate of the Battle of Britain. He ordered the bulk of the attacks redirected from military airfields to the cities. On September 15, 1940, with Churchill watching from the No. 11 Group Command Centre at Uxbridge, the Luftwaffe launched its largest final offensive. Fighter Command shot down 56 enemy aircraft against 29 of its own. 4 days later, Hitler indefinitely postponed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. In August and September, the heart of the battle, the RAF lost 723 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost more than 2,000. Of the 2,917 airmen who fought under Fighter Command's banner, only 2,334 were British. The rest included 145 Poles, 126 New Zealanders, 98 Canadians, 88 Czechs, 33 Australians, 29 Belgians, and 25 South Africans, among others. Many of the Polish pilots were under 25 and flew for their destroyed country with a fury that unsettled even their allies. Had the Luftwaffe won that battle, the land invasion of Britain would have followed. Germany would have controlled the North Atlantic and the entire European coast from Narvik to Hendaye. The Allies' strategic horizon would have closed completely. 4. Lend-Lease, the arsenal of democracy changes hands, March 1941. On the night of March 8, 1941, the United States Senate passed the Lend-Lease Act. Roosevelt had championed it in a radio address the previous December with a phrase that became famous: "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." The program changed the material equation of the war in a way no single battle ever could. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States transferred approximately $50 billion in equipment and supplies to its allies under Lend-Lease, equivalent to roughly $650 billion of today's dollars. Great Britain received the largest share, nearly $31.4 billion. The Soviet Union received approximately $11.3 billion in material, 400,000 motor vehicles including Studebakers, Dodges and Jeeps, 14,000 aircraft, 13,000 tanks, 1,900 railway locomotives, more than 100 million kilograms of explosives, and roughly 4.5 million tons of food. The practical scope of those figures was concrete to an extreme degree. Soviet soldiers ate canned American pork in the trenches of Stalingrad. The sappers clearing minefields before Kursk drove 2.5-ton Studebaker trucks. Generals coordinated their offensives over American-made radios. Marshal Georgy Zhukov acknowledged after the war without ambiguity that without Studebaker vehicles, the Red Army could not have carried out the deep offensive operations that defined 1943 and 1944. Soviet artillery could maneuver at speed because its towing tractors were American. Without the high-octane aviation fuel arriving from the United States, some 2.5 million tons during the war, Soviet air power would have flown at a considerably slower pace. Even Stalin himself, at a dinner with Roosevelt during the Tehran Conference in November 1943, offered a toast in terms his interpreters described as a genuine acknowledgement of America's role. For Britain, Lend-Lease arrived at the most precarious moment. After Dunkirk, the British Expeditionary Force had abandoned nearly all its heavy equipment in France, some 2,500 guns, 700 tanks and more than 90,000 rifles. The 50 World War I-era destroyers Roosevelt handed over in September 1940 in exchange for naval bases in the Caribbean were outdated and required extensive repairs, but they offered immediate relief for North Atlantic patrols, where Donitz's U-boats sank 688,000 tons of cargo in a single month in April 1941 alone. The Atlantic was the artery through which everything else flowed. Germany knew it. Gross Admiral Raeder had understood it from the start. Submarine warfare had to sink ships faster than Allied shipyards could build them. At its peak in 1942, U-boats sank 1,664 ships, totaling more than 7.7 million tons of displacement. Every sunken ship was ammunition, fuel, or food that never arrived. It was the gravest logistical challenge the Allies faced throughout the entire war, and it could only be sustained because American industrial production replaced losses at a rate Berlin could not anticipate. The Kaiser shipyards in Richmond, California, managed to put a Liberty ship into service, 134 meters long, 10,000 tons of cargo capacity, in 4.5 days of continuous work. The multiplier effect of Lend-Lease is hard to overstate. At the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, Soviet T-34 tanks rolled on American-made rubber tires. Pilots of the 5th Guards Army fought in yaks and lavochkins, whose instruments were American-made. In the minefields of Belarus in the spring of 1944, American Studebakers even transported the deported Chechens, 390,000 people expelled by Stalin's order, to Kazakhstan before those same trucks returned to the Red Army's supply routes. Without Lend-Lease, the war of attrition on the Eastern Front would have been incomparably slower, bloodier, and less predictable in outcome. The program did not win battles by itself. It provided something more fundamental: the material endurance to fight them. 5. Operation Barbarossa. The day Germany lost the war, June 22, 1941. At 3:15 in the morning on June 22, 1941, German artillery opened fire simultaneously along an 1,800-kilometer front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. It was the largest land attack in human history. Nearly 3 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish, Romanian, Hungarian and Italian forces, launched against the Soviet Union. Stalin had received more than 80 clear warnings of the impending attack. He ignored all of them. When German ambassador Friedrich von der Schulenburg, a man who would later be executed for his part in the July 20, 1944 plot to assassinate Hitler, personally warned him of the danger, Stalin exploded. "Disinformation has reached the level of an ambassador." He ordered that a German deserter who had crossed the lines the night before to warn of the invasion be shot for spreading false information. On the first day of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed some 1,800 Soviet aircraft on the ground, against only 35 of its own lost. Soviet divisions at the border had their tractors requisitioned for the harvest, so their artillery could not move. Officers, terrified by the NKVD after purges that had eliminated 35% of the command staff, were paralyzed. Why was Barbarossa the moment Germany lost the war, if it was at first a devastating success? Because Hitler had decided to fight simultaneously against the world's two largest industrial economies. He had ignored Bismarck's warning against invading Russia and the basic lesson that a two-front war is a lost war. The Hunger Plan, designed by Secretary of State Herbert Back, anticipated the death of 30 million Soviet citizens in order to feed the German army. The Commissar Order of June 6, 1941, instructed commanders to shoot all captured political commissars. These directives not only turned the war into a genocide, they also guaranteed that the Soviets would fight to the last man, because surrender meant death. Hitler himself told his generals on March 30, 1941, "This is a war of extermination." And it was. And that decision meant that the Soviet army, despite its catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, never stopped fighting. The German plan calculated that the USSR would collapse within 8 weeks. "We only have to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down," Hitler told his generals. But the structure did not come crashing down. And on the other side of that door, Germany found something its strategists had no plan for: the Russian winter, the immense space, and the ability of Soviet industry to be evacuated. Entire factories, dismantled and shipped by rail beyond the Urals, and relaunched in the Siberian void. 6. Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war, the month of December that changed everything, December 7th to 11th, 1941. On Sunday, December 7th, 1941, or December 8th in Tokyo local time, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida adjusted his binoculars over the waters of Pearl Harbor from the cockpit of his bomber. At 7:49 in the morning, he sent the signal, "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger," to the Japanese carrier fleet waiting to the north. The surprise was total. The first wave of 183 aircraft struck Battleship Row with torpedoes and bombs. The USS Oklahoma slowly capsized. More than 400 men died trapped beneath its hull. The USS Arizona exploded in a fireball that killed more than 1,000 men in seconds. By the end of the attack, the US Navy had lost 2 destroyers destroyed and several battleships sunk or damaged, along with 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,335 American servicemen were dead. What Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had feared was confirmed. The American carriers were not in port that weekend. The USS Enterprise and the Hornet had departed days earlier. Yamamoto, the most clear-eyed of the Japanese naval commanders, did not join the celebrations in Tokyo that night. He had lived in the United States, had studied at Harvard, and knew better than anyone what was coming. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he is said to have remarked, though the exact quote remains disputed among historians. Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived at Pearl Harbor in late December to take command of the Pacific Fleet. He was a soft-spoken Texan, descended from impoverished German nobility, who made decisions with quiet authority and gathered around him men who would show him extraordinary loyalty. But the truly decisive moment of December 1941 was not the Japanese attack. It was Germany's declaration of war on the United States on December 11th. Hitler was not obligated by the Tripartite Pact to declare war on the United States after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The pact was defensive. Japan had attacked first. But Hitler, in a delirium of Napoleonic euphoria over apparent victories in the East, declared war voluntarily. His advisors, including Ribbentrop, could barely contain their astonishment. Goebbels himself noted in his diary that the news of Pearl Harbor had struck like a bolt from the blue. Churchill, at Chequers, when the news reached him, said that night he slept for the first time in a long while. The entry of the United States into the war on both fronts meant that the world's largest industrial production, already supporting Britain and the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, poured completely into the Allied war effort. By 1944, the United States alone would produce more war material than all the Axis countries combined. The morning of December 7th, 1941, changed the balance of power in the Pacific. On December 11th, Hitler changed it across the entire world. 7. The Battle of Midway, 4 carriers in 6 minutes. June 4th to 7th, 1942. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida watched from the deck of the carrier Akagi as Japanese mechanics rearmed the planes with ground attack bombs for a second wave against Midway Atoll. On the lower hangar deck, torpedoes and bombs were stacked without the safety cages that protect warheads during routine operations. The rush left no time for protocol. At 10:20, the order came, "Prepare to launch." At 10:24, someone on the deck of the Akagi shouted, "Hell divers!" What followed lasted less than 6 minutes. The SBD Dauntless dive bombers of the USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown had spent most of the morning lost over the Pacific, searching for the Japanese fleet. They had arrived in separate, disorganized waves. The slow, obsolete TBD Devastator torpedo bombers had arrived first and had been massacred by Japanese Zeros. Of 41 torpedo planes that attacked, 35 did not return. They scored not a single hit. But that slaughter was, in tactical terms, providential. The Japanese Zero fighters had dropped to low altitude to pursue the torpedo planes. When the Dauntlesses appeared out of the clouds at 3,000 meters, the decks of the Japanese carriers were bare of air cover, crowded with rearmed, fully fueled aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey made the decision to extend the search even though his planes were nearly out of fuel. His 2 squadrons found the wake of a Japanese destroyer and followed that trail. What they found at the end of that trail were 4 carriers. The first 3 hits on the Akagi were not, individually, fatal blows. But the chain reaction explosion of the armed planes in the hangar turned the carrier into an inferno within minutes. The Kaga suffered 4 hits. The Soryu was struck and its ammunition stores began to explode. The Soryu's commander, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto, refused to be evacuated. The last his men saw of him was his figure standing on the bridge engulfed in flames, shouting, "Banzai!" In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 elite carriers of Japan's first air fleet were ablaze. Shortly afterward, planes from the Enterprise struck the 4th, the Hiryu. Japan lost at Midway 250 aircraft, 4 first-line carriers, 1 cruiser, and more than 3,000 sailors, including hundreds of veteran pilots from Pearl Harbor and the South Pacific Campaign, who would take years to replace. Admiral Nimitz acknowledged it openly in his report. Had we lacked early information of the Japanese movements, and had we been caught with carrier forces dispersed, as at one time seemed possible, or even as far away as the Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway would have ended differently. The difference was Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptanalysis team at Pearl Harbor, who had broken the Japanese naval code. Rochefort, who often worked in a red silk bathrobe and slippers, had identified AF as the code for Midway by setting a decoy trap, sending an uncoded message saying Midway was short of water. 2 days later, the Japanese transmitted that AF was short of water. The trap worked. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific. Japan never regained the initiative. 8. Stalingrad, Operation Uranus and the Steel Trap, November 19th to 23rd, 1942. By the fall of 1942, the city of Stalingrad had become the personal symbol of 2 dictators. Hitler had promised to conquer it. Stalin had ordered it defended to the last man. General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the 62nd Army trapped in the strip of the city along the Volga, replied to Commissar Nikita Khrushchev with a single sentence when asked about his mission: "We will defend the city or die trying." Chuikov was a general of a different breed. He had the broad face of a Russian peasant and dark curly hair. He struck officers who failed him. He set up his command post at Mamayev Kurgan, the 102-meter mound that dominated the city and the river, under direct artillery fire. He understood from the first day something his superiors took weeks to grasp. German soldiers detested close-quarters combat in confined spaces. In open country, the Wehrmacht was an almost unbeatable machine. Inside a destroyed building, amid concrete rubble and steel beams, with shells unable to distinguish friend from foe, their tactical advantages disappeared. Hugging them, Chuikov called it, embracing the enemy so closely that the Luftwaffe would not dare bomb. His lines could be no more than 50 meters from the German ones. The 62nd Army was the bait. When it arrived at Stalingrad in September 1942, it had 20,000 men and fewer than 60 tanks, most of them immobile, buried like fixed artillery batteries. In the first days of the battle, the German 6th Army under General Friedrich Paulus launched wave after wave of assaults that pushed the 62nd Army back to a strip barely 200 meters wide along the Volga. That strip did not yield. On the night of September 14th, the 13th Guards Division under Major General Rodimtsev, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, crossed the 1,300-meter-wide Volga in barges and rowboats under German fire, with no time even to fix bayonets before launching the attack on the far bank. Every unit reinforcing the city crossed that river exposed to artillery, Stukas, and machine gun fire. Many were replenished with their own dead. The city turned to rubble was Chuikov's weapon. The ruins created by Luftwaffe bombing became the battlefield that destroyed the attacker. Soviet snipers like Vasily Zaitsev, a 24-year-old Siberian hunter turned propaganda figure, and the anonymous Anatoly Chekhov, whose memories correspondent Vasily Grossman recorded in chilling detail, operated from collapsed floors and sewer gaps, choosing their victims by the rank marked on the uniform. Gunners were a priority target, so were soldiers who went out to fetch water. In September 1942 alone, the 6th Army expended 25 million rounds of infantry ammunition. The 62nd Army, with its limited resources, could not even spare a machine gun belt for guard duty at an outpost. The women pilots of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment flew every night in wooden Po-2 biplanes over the German lines, cutting the engines at the last moment so the silent glide would terrify the sentries. The Germans called them the Night Witches. Soviet artillery ammunition came from across the Volga in small barges that German aircraft attacked by day. Frontline female medics crossed the terrain under fire to drag out the wounded, often getting under a fallen man's body to carry him on their backs. Those at the overwhelmed field hospitals gave arm-to-arm transfusions with their own blood. Stalin, who was normally incapable of waiting, listened to his generals for once. Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky explained to him that the solution was not a frontal attack on the German wall, but to encircle it from the flanks, where the Axis forces were weaker. The northern and southern flanks of the Sixth Army were covered by the Third and Fourth Romanian armies, whose troops lacked modern anti-tank equipment, had very low morale, and bore bitter resentment toward the German officers who frequently insulted them. Soviet intelligence had interrogated Romanian prisoners who described soldiers mutilating themselves to avoid service, daily pay equivalent to the price of a liter of milk, and officers who beat their men. On the night of November 18th to 19th, Soviet sappers disguised in white camouflage uniforms crawled through the snow past the Romanian sentry posts to clear minefields. At 7:30 in the morning on November 19th, hundreds of howitzers, mortars and Katyusha batteries fired simultaneously. The ground shook 50 kilometers away. A soldier of the German 371st Infantry Regiment later told his NKVD interrogator, "If the Katyusha sings a couple more times, all that will be left of us are our iron buttons." On November 23rd, the pincers of Operation Uranus closed at Kalach-on-Don. The German Sixth Army, 300,000 men, was surrounded. General Paulus requested permission to break out. Hitler refused. Goering promised the Luftwaffe could supply the surrounded troops with 500 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe never managed to deliver more than 100 tons on its best days, and in December, bad weather closed the airfields. The soldiers of the Sixth Army began to starve. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The horses died and were eaten. Then the dogs. The daily ration, which in October was 750 grams of bread, fell to 200 in December and to 75 in January. Military doctors recorded the first cases of severe dystrophy in November. By January 1943, it was the normal condition. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler the night before, in a gesture that was an implicit order to commit suicide rather than surrender, since no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner, surrendered to Soviet General Mikhail Shumilov in the basement of the Univermag department store in Stalingrad. On February 2nd, the last holdouts of the Sixth Army laid down their arms. Of the 300,000 men surrounded, about 91,000 were taken prisoner. Of those, only about 6,000 ever returned to Germany. The rest died of hunger, cold, or disease in Soviet camps. Stalingrad was the first great irreversible German disaster on the Eastern Front. It proved that the Red Army could plan and execute large-scale operations with high-level strategic deception. And it proved something else, that the Sixth Army could be destroyed. German invincibility had died in the snow of the Don. 9. Alamein, Rommel ultra-intelligence and the point of no return in the desert, October 23rd to November 4th, 1942. At 2040, on October 23rd, 1942, General Bernard Montgomery's artillery opened a bombardment on the Afrika Korps positions that lit up the entire horizon. From a distance, observers wrote, it looked like storm lightning covering the sky from end to end. General Georg Stumme, commanding the Panzer Army Africa in Rommel's absence, who was convalescing in Germany, had received orders not to return fire in order to conserve ammunition. Stumme drove out to see the situation for himself. When his vehicle came under attack, the driver accelerated without realizing the general had jumped out. Stumme's body was not found until the next day. He had died of a heart attack. Montgomery held an advantage Rommel did not know about. Ultra-decrypts from Bletchley Park had revealed the German defensive plan with almost perfect precision, including the location of the minefields. the Devil's Gardens Rommel had designed, and the disposition of the armoured units. Operation Lightfoot was prepared with that knowledge. Rommel, learning of the British offensive and of Stuma's death, flew from Germany via Rome. He reached his headquarters at dusk on October 25th. What he found was a situation deteriorating irreversibly. His tanks were consuming fuel that Allied ships were sinking in the Mediterranean before it ever reached the African shore. The Royal Navy and the Desert Air Force had built a logistical trap around the Africa Corps long before the first shots were fired at El Alamein. The battle was decided not in a single blow but in a slow crushing. The 9th Armoured Brigade was sent on a frontal charge against anti-tank positions that Montgomery himself knew would be suicidal. He was told so. He replied that it was necessary. The brigade was nearly wiped out, but the already exhausted German resistance could take no more. On November 3rd, Rommel sent a message to the OKW explaining that he needed to withdraw. Hitler answered with one of his famous extermination orders. There can be no other thought but to stand fast and throw every gun and every man into the battle. He promised air support and supplies that would never arrive. He ended, "It would not be the first time in history that a strong will has triumphed over the bigger battalions. As to your troops, you can show them no other road than that to victory or death." Rommel, who knew those orders were a fantasy, had the fatal weakness of obeying them for hours before finally beginning the withdrawal. The delay cost thousands of lives, most of them Italian, left behind without motorized transport in the desert. The Afrika Korps escaped. But the myth of Rommel as the invincible desert general died at El Alamein. And with it died Germany's last chance to cut the Suez Canal, seize the oil fields of the Middle East, and change the strategic equation of the Mediterranean. Goebbels understood it before anyone. We are at a turning point of the war. 10 Kursk and Prokhorovka, Germany's last strike in the east, July 5th to 23rd, 1943. Operation Citadel was meant to recapture the German initiative on the Eastern Front. The plan was simple on paper: attack the Soviet salient at Kursk from north and south, cut off the entrenched forces inside, and destroy them in a great encirclement. Hitler proclaimed in his order of April 15, 1943, "The victory at Kursk must be a beacon for the whole world." What Germany did not know, well, what Hitler denied, was that the Soviets had been expecting it for months. Soviet agent John Cairncross, who worked at Bletchley Park and passed information to Soviet foreign intelligence through his liaison officer in London, provided precise details of the German plan, including the location of Luftwaffe airfields in the region. In May 1943, Soviet aircraft launched preemptive strikes on those airfields and destroyed more than 500 planes on the ground. Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky convinced Stalin that the best strategy was to absorb the blow on defense and then counterattack. Stalin, usually impatient, agreed to wait. What followed was the largest defensive preparation in history. More than 300,000 mobilized civilians helped build 8 defensive lines, stretching almost 300 kilometers into the rear. Sappers laid more than 500,000 mines within the salient. 9,000 kilometers of trenches were dug. Anti-tank guns were camouflaged and under orders not to fire until the panzers were within 20 meters. On July 5, 1943, the German offensive began 2 hours late because the Soviets had already launched a preemptive bombardment after capturing a prisoner who revealed the H-hour. In the northern sector, General Walter Model's 9th Army met desperate resistance. In the southern sector, General Paul Hausser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps advanced further, but it too found layers of defense absorbing its attacks like sponges. The new Panther tanks, sent straight from the production lines in Germany, proved mechanically unreliable, and many caught fire on their own. On July 12th, in the wheat fields southeast of Prokhorovka, General Rotmistrov launched the counterattack of the 5th Guards Tank Army. What followed was, for decades, described as the greatest tank battle in history, though later research has qualified the original figures. The T-34s charged at top speed against the Tigers of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Rotmistrov had ordered his men to close in as much as possible because Soviet shells bounced off the Tiger's frontal armor at long range. The German tanks, for their part, lost their range advantage in close quarters fighting. An Obersturmführer Rudolf von Ribbentrop, son of the German foreign minister, described the scene from the turret of his Tiger. "What I saw left me speechless. From behind a rise in the ground 150 to 200 meters away, 15, then 30, then 40 tanks appeared. In the end, there were too many to count." That same July 12th, the Allies landed in Sicily. Hitler halted Operation Citadel 3 days later on July 13th, redirecting SS divisions to Italy. For the Soviets, it was the signal to launch their own offensives, Kutuzov in the north, Polkovodets, Rumyantsev in the south. Germany would never again launch a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. 11. Italy and the fall of Mussolini, the ally that fell apart, July to September 1943. In the early hours of July 10, 1943, Anglo-American units landed on the southern coast of Sicily. The Italian campaign, which Churchill had passionately championed against American reluctance, promised to strike the soft underbelly of the Axis. The soft flank turned out to be a razor blade, but what the Italian campaign did achieve was to precipitate the political collapse of the fascist regime. On July 25, 1943, the Grand Council of Fascism voted to remove Benito Mussolini. King Victor Emmanuel III had him arrested that same night as he left an audience. The Duce was taken by ambulance to a secret location. The Italian surrender, signed on September 8, 1943, withdrew Italy from the Axis side. Germany responded with Operation Eiche, Oak, on September 12th. A Fallschirmjäger commando under Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny rescued Mussolini from his prison at Gran Sasso in the Abruzzo in a glider operation that went down in the history of special operations. Hitler reinstalled him as a puppet ruler of the Italian Social Republic based in Salo. But the true effect of the Italian campaign was strategic and one of attrition. Germany had to send divisions badly needed in the east and in France to defend the peninsula. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring built defensive lines, the Gustav Line, the Gothic Line, that delayed the Allied advance for months at enormous cost on both sides. Monte Cassino was destroyed 3 times before it fell. For the Allies, the Italian front was a slow bleed. For Germany, it was another front it could not afford. 12. D-Day, Overlord and the opening of the Second Front, June 6, 1944. On June 5, 1944, General Eisenhower studied the weather reports at his headquarters at Southwick House, north of Portsmouth. The storm in the English Channel continued. Waves exceeded 1.5 meters, but his chief meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg, presented him with a small window. The weather might improve marginally on the night of June 5th to 6th. Eisenhower weighed it in silence for several minutes. The invasion fleet had already left port. Postponing it 2 weeks meant coinciding with the worst storm in the Channel in 40 years, which indeed struck the coast on June 19th and would have destroyed the operation. General Miles Dempsey, who would command the British Second Army, later said Eisenhower's decision to proceed was the bravest act of the war. Eisenhower said, "Let's go." Operation Overlord was extraordinary, not only in its scale. 156,000 soldiers landed on the first day, supported by 11,000 aircraft and more than 6,000 ships, but in the complexity of its deception plan. Operation Fortitude had convinced the Germans that Normandy was a decoy and the real attack would come at the Pas de Calais, led by General George Patton. Even after the landing, the Germans kept the 15th Army at the Pas de Calais, waiting for a second attack that never came. The hardest fighting of D-Day happened on Omaha Beach. The preliminary naval and air bombardment had failed. The planes had waited too long to release their bombs, and all of them fell inland without touching a single beach position. When the landing craft ramps dropped, The men of the 1st and 29th American Infantry Divisions walked straight into machine gun fire from the bluffs. The duplex drive tanks, designed to float to shore, sank in the rough sea. Within a few hours, Omaha Beach was a slaughterhouse. General Omar Bradley briefly considered abandoning it, but isolated groups of soldiers found routes up the bluffs. American and British destroyers moved dangerously close to shore and fired with precision on the German bunkers. By the end of the day, the beach was taken. Overlord worked because the Germans could not know when or where the Allies would attack until they did. And when they found out, Hitler was asleep. The Führer had returned late the night before from Munich, and his aides refused to wake him to release the reserve panzer divisions. By the time the panzers moved, it was too late. The opening of the Western Front meant Germany was now fighting on 3 simultaneous fronts: in the east against the Red Army, in the south against the Allies in Italy, and in the west against the combined weight of the Anglo-American army. It was the strategic nightmare Hitler had promised to avoid. 13 Operation Barbarossa, the strike that destroyed Army Group Center, June 23 to August 19, 1944. While the Allies fought in Normandy to break out of the bocage, the Red Army launched on June 23, 1944, the largest offensive in its history, Operation Bagration, named after Tsarist General Pyotr Bagration, who died at the Battle of Borodino in 1812, struck the German Army Group Center with 4 coordinated Soviet fronts, more than 1.2 million soldiers, 4,000 tanks and 5,300 aircraft. In 8 weeks, the operation completely destroyed the German Army Group Center. 25 German divisions were annihilated or captured. German casualties exceeded 400,000 men, more than at Stalingrad. The Soviet front advanced about 600 kilometers westward. Bagration was made possible by maskirovka, Soviet strategic masking, carried out as a fine art. Reinforcements traveled by night, vehicles operated without headlights, troop concentrations were hidden under forest canopy, and the Germans expected the attack in Ukraine, not in Belarus. The operation confirmed that the Red Army of 1944 was a completely different military instrument from that of 1941. Its generals had learned, at an incalculable cost in human lives, to coordinate artillery, infantry, armor, and aviation in deep breakthrough operations. What Tukhachevsky had theorized in the 1930s before being shot in the purges, his successors now executed with brutal precision. 14. Operation Market Garden. A Bridge Too Far, September 17th to 27th, 1944. On September 17, 1944, 3 airborne divisions, the American 82nd and 101st and the British 1st, jumped from their planes over southern Holland to seize a chain of bridges over canals and rivers all the way to the Lower Rhine at Arnhem. General Brian Horrocks' 33rd Corps was to advance along a single road to relieve them before their ammunition and water ran out. It was the boldest plan Montgomery had ever devised. Bradley, who knew him well, said that if Montgomery had shown up at Schaff drunk, he could not have been more astonished than he was by this proposal. Warnings existed. Dutch intelligence had reported that the 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were resting in the woods around Arnhem. Major Brian Urquhart, intelligence officer of the British 1st Airborne Division, presented aerial photographs showing tanks. He was sent on sick leave for nervous exhaustion. The operation failed through the accumulation of small catastrophes. The drop zones were too far from the bridges. Tactical radios failed almost entirely in the wooded terrain around Arnhem. The Germans reacted with a speed no one expected, largely thanks to Field Marshal Model, who was having lunch at a hotel in Arnhem when the airborne attack began and personally organized the response. XXX Corps advanced more slowly than planned due to ambushes along the single available road, which the soldiers began calling Hell's Highway. On September 27th, the survivors of the British 1st Airborne Division, besieged for 9 days without food, without ammunition and drinking rainwater, were evacuated across the Rhine at night. The Germans captured nearly 6,000 prisoners, half of them wounded. Total Allied losses reached about 15,000 men. Market Garden did not change the war's final outcome, but it changed its timeline. Had it succeeded, the Allies would have crossed the Rhine in September 1944 and could have reached Berlin in the spring of 1945 ahead of the Soviets. The peace conference, the map of Europe, the line of the Iron Curtain. All of it might have been different. The failure at Arnhem meant the war continued another 8 months, cost hundreds of thousands more lives, and allowed the Red Army to reach Berlin, Warsaw, and Vienna first. 15. The Ardennes Offensive. Hitler's last roll of the dice, December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, 1,900 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a 135-kilometer front in the Ardennes. The effect was disorienting. American soldiers scrambled out of their sleeping bags and huddled at the bottom of their foxholes. When the bombardment ended, they saw a strange light. It wasn't dawn. It was artificial moonlight. German searchlights bouncing their beams off the clouds to illuminate the infantry's advance in snow camouflage. Hitler had named the operation Autumn Mist. Its stated objective was to retake Antwerp, cut off the supply of the Allied Northern Army Group, and force a negotiated peace. His own generals knew it was a fantasy. General Feldmarschall Rundstedt, whose name would be linked to the offensive, though he was not its author, simply considered it unreal. General Oberst Gruppenführer Josef Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, which was to be the spearhead, said after the war, "All I had to do was cross the river, capture Brussels, and then take the port of Antwerp. And all this in December, January and February, through the deepest snow, with reduced petrol supplies, in the toughest terrain of Central Europe in the worst winter for 20 years, with barely enough infantry to hold the ground, and my troops exhausted." The furthest advancing tip of the offensive was the Kampfgruppe Peiper, led by Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper with 68-ton Tiger II tanks, crossing minefields by brute force when bridges were destroyed. Peiper advanced extraordinarily far. On December 17th, soldiers of his unit massacred 84 unarmed American prisoners at Malmedy, but the Americans held. The 101st Airborne Division, still recovering from Market Garden, was trucked to Bastogne, the key road junction, and defended it while surrounded for days. When the German general sent Bastogne a note demanding surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe replied with a single word: "Nuts!" Eisenhower responded to the crisis quickly. At the Verdun conference on December 19th, while the other generals seemed downcast, it was Patton who took the temperature. "I have stopped my attacks to the east. I need 48 hours to turn the Third Army north and relieve Bastogne." His generals told him it was impossible. Patton did it in 3 days. On December 26th, columns of the Third Army broke the encirclement of Bastogne. The Ardennes offensive was contained and then reversed. But for Germany, the cost was catastrophic, between 60,000 and 100,000 casualties, and the loss of armoured reserves that could never be replaced. The German army in the West was left irreversibly weakened for the defence of the Reich itself. 16. Dresden, Hamburg, and the Strategic Bombing Offensive, the debate that continues, 1943 to 1945. Speaking of the strategic bombing campaign as a moment that changed the war requires historiographical honesty. The debate over its real effectiveness remains one of the most controversial of World War II. In July 1943, Operation Gomorrah, the attacks on Hamburg, created for the first time in history an artificial firestorm. Conditions of extreme heat generated winds of up to 240 kilometers per hour that sucked people into the flames. Approximately 37,000 civilians died in a week. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, told Hitler that if the Allies carried out 6 similar attacks on other industrial cities, weapons production would collapse. They did not. The Allies continued the bombing, but without systematically concentrating on industrial bottlenecks. German arms production, in fact, reached its peak in 1944 under Speer's direction, despite the bombing. The question is what that production would have been without the bombing. Most historians' answer is much higher. The bombing destroyed cities, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians, and forced Germany to devote enormous resources, including entire anti-aircraft artillery divisions, fighters that would otherwise have flown on the Eastern Front, and more than 1 million workers on repairs, to air defense. But the cost was enormous for the Allies too. British Bomber Command lost 55,573 airmen killed during the war, the highest casualty rate of any British service. Nearly 90 crews of the American 8th Air Force deliberately landed in Sweden or Switzerland to be interned. On February 13th and 14th, 1945, the bombing of Dresden, a city of limited industrial importance but full of refugees fleeing the Red Army, killed between 22,000 and 25,000 people, according to the most recent and rigorous estimate from the 2010 German Historical Commission, though figures have been exaggerated up to 1 million in some accounts. Dresden became the most controversial symbol of a strategy that mixed legitimate targets with mass destruction of civilians. What is clear? The attack on the German synthetic fuel system from mid-1944 onward was the aspect of the bombing campaign that most effectively crippled German operational capacity. When the Luftwaffe and the Panzer divisions began running out of fuel in the winter of 1944 to 1945, it was in part a direct consequence of the destruction of refineries and synthetic fuel plants. 17. The Holocaust and the decision for the final solution. The killing machine in motion, 1942. In January 1942, at a villa on the shore of Lake Wannsee in Berlin, 14 senior Reich officials met for less than 2 hours to coordinate what their documents called the final solution to the Jewish question. The Wannsee Protocol, drafted by Adolf Eichmann and signed by Reinhard Heydrich, is one of the coldest and most disturbing documents in history, a bureaucratic record of the decision to murder 11 million people. This did not happen in a vacuum, nor was it simply the execution of a plan that had always existed as such. The decision to industrialize murder emerged from a confluence of factors: frustration over mass deportations to the east, while the war against the USSR did not end as expected, ideological radicalization under the pressure of war, and the murderous momentum that the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into the east, had shown to be possible since the summer of 1941. Treblinka, built in northeastern Poland in 1942, had no factories, no medical selection, no forced labor. It was exclusively an immediate extermination center. In roughly 15 months of operation, between July 1942 and August 1943, the most widely accepted estimates put the number gassed there between 700,000 and 900,000 people. The staff numbered only a few hundred men. Historian Lawrence Rees, in his exhaustive study of the Holocaust, documents how the perpetrators, most of them ordinary men before the war, progressively adapted to violence. The process was not blind obedience to irresistible orders. It was the gradual normalization of crime within a system that rewarded brutality and punished mercy. The Holocaust matters in the context of this script not because it was part of the war's military strategy, but because it is inseparable from it. Hitler sacrificed scarce military resources, trains, personnel, ammunition, to continue the extermination even when the war was already lost. Deportations to Auschwitz from Hungary in the spring of 1944 continued while the Allies were landing in Normandy. Until the Reich's final days, the machinery of genocide kept running. 6 million Jews murdered, millions more Poles, Soviets, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals. The Holocaust did not change the outcome of the war. It was what the war was at its darkest core. August 20th, 1944. At 12:42 on July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg left the conference room at Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, the Wolfschanze, in Rastenburg, on the pretext of taking a phone call. 4 minutes later, a bomb hidden in a leather briefcase exploded beneath the map table where Hitler was following the meeting. Hitler survived. The briefcase had been accidentally moved to the other side of a thick oak table leg by Colonel Heinz Brandt, who needed room to lean over the map. That wooden obstacle absorbed part of the blast. 4 of those present died. Hitler emerged with his uniform shredded, ruptured eardrums, burns, and a damaged hand. Colonel Friedrich von der Schulenburg, the same former ambassador in Moscow who had tried to warn Stalin about Barbarossa, was one of the executed conspirators. They were tried before the People's Court with Judge Roland Freisler, who subjected them to public humiliation. Most were executed by slow strangulation with piano wire at Plötzensee prison, and several executions were filmed for Hitler to watch that night. Had the bomb killed Hitler on July 20th, 1944, the war would have ended months earlier. The conspirators had contacts with the Western Allies. The successor in the chain of command the conspirators had agreed on was General Ludwig Beck. Peace terms would likely have been negotiated before the Red Army crossed the Oder line. Instead, Hitler survived, convinced that Providence had specially protected him. He tightened his control over military operations, rejecting any tactical retreat and ordering the defense to the last man of positions that no longer held any strategic value. The last 10 months of the war in Europe cost more lives, German, Soviet, Allied, and civilian, than the previous 4 years. 19. The atomic bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the end of a war, August 6th and 9th, 1945. On August 6th, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay opened its bomb bay doors over Hiroshima. Less than a minute later, the equivalent of approximately 13,000 tons of TNT detonated 600 meters above the ground over the center of the city. An estimated 80,000 people died in the instant of detonation, and many tens of thousands more in the following days, weeks, and years from burns, radiation, and injuries caused by the blast wave. The entire city, a military base with a civilian population of around 350,000, vanished in a cloud of burning dust. President Truman warned Japan it could expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. On August 9th, when Japan had not responded with a formal surrender, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. About 35,000 people died instantly. That same day, the Red Army crossed the Manchurian border with 1.5 million soldiers, attacking the Japanese Kwantung Army. The decision to use the bombs remains one of the deepest debates in modern history. Defenders argue that a land invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Olympic, planned for Kyushu in November 1945, would have cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and possibly millions of Japanese lives. Given that around 25% of Okinawa's civilian population died during the battle there, an equivalent operation on the main islands would have produced incomparable numbers. Critics point out that Japan was already militarily on the verge of collapse due to the naval blockade and the bombing of its cities, and that the decision also had a dimension of demonstrating power to the Soviet Union, since the Potsdam talks were happening simultaneously. Stalin already knew about the bomb. His spies within the Manhattan Project had informed him of the test in New Mexico on July 16, 1945, 2 days before Truman mentioned it to him at Potsdam. The anecdote is revealing. When Truman told Stalin the United States had a new weapon of unusual power, Stalin simply nodded and said he hoped it would be put to good use. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his people by radio for the first time. His voice was halting, the imperial diction nearly incomprehensible to an ordinary listener. But the message was clear. Japan accepted the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. The war had ended. Without the atomic bombs, In the assessment of historian Anthony Beevor and others, the emperor would not have found the calm resolve he showed in imposing surrender on the military, who wanted to keep fighting from caves in the mountains. The war would have lasted at least until 1946. 20. Stalingrad as symbol, Berlin. As conclusion, the moment the curtain fell, April 25th to May 8th, 1945. On April 25, 1945, soldiers of the Red Army and American troops met at the Elbe River near Torgau. They embraced, they took photographs, they drank vodka. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had its days numbered. In Berlin, the Red Army was closing the circle. General Vasily Chuikov, the same man who had defended Stalingrad meter by meter with the 62nd Army, now commanded the 8th Guards Army, advancing on the German capital from the south. Zhukov attacked from the east. The city's last defences were held in part by Hitler Youth volunteers, teenagers armed with Panzerfausts who had not yet finished school. Hitler had rejected every offer of surrender and every request to withdraw. On April 30th, 1945, with the Soviets less than a kilometre from the Chancellery bunker, Adolf Hitler shot himself in the right temple. Eva Braun, whom he had married the night before, took cyanide. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden and burned with gasoline. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender in the early hours of May 8th to 9th, 1945, before Marshal Georgy Zhukov in Karlshorst, Berlin. In Europe, the war had ended. What had those 20 moments changed over 6 years? American and British air supremacy destroyed Germany's ability to fight on the move. The courage of the men at Dunkirk allowed a British army to exist to fight the war at all. The Battle of Britain prevented Germany from closing off the Atlantic. Midway preserved America's ability to counterattack in the Pacific. Stalingrad proved that Europe's most powerful army could be destroyed. Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war brought the world's largest industrial economy into the conflict. Lend-Lease supplied the material without which none of those moments could have happened. And beneath it all, Germany's decision to wage a war of extermination against the Slavic peoples, against the Jews, against everyone it declared subhuman, gave its adversaries reasons that went beyond geopolitics never to give in. Men are pushed further when they know what happens if they lose. On May 8, 1945, Europe counted its dead. It still counts them.